Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. If you are behind bars in Illinois' prison system, what educational programs and services are available to help you get your life back on track? That's the question public radio reporter Lee Gaines set out to answer in an ongoing series looking at funding, challenges, and policy changes affecting learning opportunities for tens of thousands of prisoners. She joins us today. Lee, welcome to EWA Radio.
Glad to be here.
Give us a primer, if you would, on Illinois' prisoner population. How many people are we talking about?
So it's actually been going down in recent years. So there's about 40,000 people incarcerated in state prisons today. That's gone down from a high of about 48,000 in 2013.
And of that number, do you know how many are currently taking advantage of educational programs behind bars?
I can tell you how many took advantage in 2017 because that's the latest year for which there's detailed data on from the Illinois Department of Corrections. So if we're talking about all post-secondary educational programming, we're looking at about 4,200 people who participated. And of those 4,200, about 341 got some type of degree. And that's the latest data that I have. I'm working on getting more up-to-date numbers for 2018.
And how do we know how that compares nationally?
I do know that we are pretty in line with national, according to this new report that came out from the Vera Institute of Justice looking at Pell Grants. There are very few people that have access to college education inside prison if we're looking across the country. So, nationally, they say that about 9% of inmates participate in some form of post-secondary education, whether that's a certificate granting program or an associate degree type program, or what's even more rare than that, an actual college and prison working towards your bachelor's degree program. And about only 2% of those people actually earn an associate's degree while incarcerated.
How consistent are those 2017 numbers from prior years?
Not consistent at all. I have data going back to 2014. I'm actually going to try and get data that goes back earlier than that. But many more people were participating in post-secondary educational programs, almost double the number, actually. And double the number were also getting degrees. And you can also see that the wait list has increased somewhat since that time period as well. Some of that can be attributed to, and maybe a majority of that can be attributed to the fact that we had a budget crisis in the state of Illinois. And all over these reports, I'm seeing this college program disappeared because of a lack of funding, or we can't hire any more teachers because of a lack of funding. Every report has that all over it. There's a lack of educators and there's a lack of money for this programming in the prison system. And I think that speaks to something that a former prison librarian from Illinois told me, which is that when times get tough in these facilities and they need to tighten their belts and cut, that's the first thing that they go to. They cut the educational programming or they cut the library funding because they are statutorily required to offer things like health care, food, and things like that. So they can't cut that. So they end up cutting these educational programs because I think they probably think of them as superfluous.
You mentioned Pell Grants, and that's federal dollars that are available to people who want to pursue post-secondary education. But that's changed in terms of prisoners' eligibility, not just in Illinois, but nationally. Get us up to speed on that.
Yeah, so historically, since Pell Grants were enacted several decades ago, prisoners did have access to them, and that changed in 1994 with the 1994 crime bill. They were denied access to that federal grant program while incarcerated. And so a lot of people at that time lost access to college programs inside prisons because they had no way to pay for those degrees anymore. Those grants were helping them to do that.
You actually found there would be some cost benefits to Illinois if those Pell Grants for prisoners were reinstated. What did you find?
Yeah, that's again from the Vera Institute of Justice report. They actually did a big national report, so you can go onto their website and find out how that breaks down for your state. But in Illinois, they were estimating, and this is dependent on the number of people that would take advantage of the Pell Grant program, they were estimating that the state could save anywhere from $8 million to $26 million per year if Pell Grant eligibility were restored to inmates. And so what that cost savings is it's based on recidivism numbers because there's a connection between education and recidivism rates.
I was actually surprised that there is some bipartisan support for reinstituting Pell Grants for prisoners. What's standing in the way?
I think it's a priorities question. You hit the nail on the head. There is bipartisan support for this, and you saw with the First Step Act, that was a major criminal justice reform bill that was passed recently, that there's a lot of advocates for Pell Grants being restored to prisoners that think this is probably just the next step. It's just a matter of time until that happens. Interestingly, though, there is some criticism of this from unexpected places. I was recently talking to the head of a college and prison program in St. Louis, and she had a lot of concerns about Pell Grants being restored, not because she doesn't think that people who are incarcerated deserve or should have access to those grants, but there was concern on her part that access to those grants would lead to predatory practices by higher education institutions, that they would see college and prison programs as a cash grab, so to speak. So they would offer a subpar education to people that are incarcerated while collecting that federal grant money.
Okay, that's fascinating. So the idea is that those predatory practices that a lot of consumer advocates are trying to crack down for students who are outside of prison, that those methods and practices could carry over to folks behind bars?
Yes, and it's not just for-profit educational institutions, it's also nonprofit educational institutions that could take advantage of this. Because when you are incarcerated, you really don't have much choice, as opposed to an educational consumer who is not incarcerated, who can make a decision about what college program I want to have access to, because typically a corrections department only contracts or allows in a very limited number of educational facilities. Honestly, in Illinois, there's only one community college that's serving most of the state's prisons. So there is an opportunity here for an abuse of the system by those higher education institutions.
We're talking with Lee Gaines of Illinois Public Media about her reporting on prison education programs. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. We wanted to mention that Lee's work on this project is supported in part by an EWA Reporting Fellowship. She does retain all editorial control over her content. Lee, I think it's worth noting that when we're talking about some long-term benefits to this prison education programs, it's not theoretical. You found some hard research. What do you know?
So there's a very famous RAND Corporation study. It's a meta-analysis of college and prison programs across the country. And basically what they found was that for every dollar that was spent on educational programming inside correctional facilities, those states could save up to $5 on reincarceration costs because of this very strong connection between educational attainment and reduced recidivism rates.
I want to turn for a moment and talk about where Illinois appears to be out of step with some national trends. Explain to us what Ban the Box is.
So I think a lot of people have probably heard about Ban the Box in relation to employment applications. There's been a movement to get rid of the question about whether or not you have a criminal record or a felony conviction on a job application. And so this movement is now, honestly, it's been happening for several years now, dating back to the Obama administration. This movement has turned its attention toward higher ed. And so essentially there are a lot of reform advocates who want to remove the criminal convictions question or criminal history question from college applications. And that is what the Ban the Box movement is all about. And so the Common App did something pretty extraordinary, which is they removed that question from the Common Application. That application is used by hundreds of colleges and universities around the country, but while the common application removed that question, that does not prevent a university or college who uses the Common App to add a supplementary page to that application to continue asking that. And that's exactly what's happening in at least one university I talked to, Millikan. It's a very small college located in Decatur. And they basically said to me, they use the Common App, but they're going to continue asking that criminal records question regardless of that organization's decision to remove it.
Do you know where the state's colleges and universities come down on that?
Well, they come down very strongly on wanting to continue to ask that question. And I know that because there is pending legislation. It's kind of died at this moment, but I am expecting it to be revived by the ACLU of Illinois. And that legislation would ban public universities and colleges from asking about people's criminal records as part of the application process. It would allow those institutions to ask about that after they've made an admissions decision, but not before. And all of the state colleges and universities that I'm aware of have come out pretty strongly against that legislation. At one point, the advocates of the legislation wanted to include private institutions as well. And I was told that they got a lot of strong pushback from the private universities in the state. So they amended the legislation to just include public universities. And they're still getting a lot of pushback on that.
You've done a lot of on-the-ground reporting for this series. How difficult has it been to get access to some of the prisoners?
It has been really, really difficult. Let me tell you about my struggles to get into one college and prison program that's actually in my backyard. I'm based in Champaign-Urbana. There is a college and prison program at the Danville Correctional Facility. Danville is about a half an hour away from where we are here. And it's been around for 10 years, which is quite a long time for a college and prison program. And I have been welcomed in by the director of that program. They're actually doing something really fascinating, which they're trying to figure out a way to measure the success of their program beyond recidivism rates. If you talk to people in the college and prison world, they're actually really frustrated with evaluating college and prison programs solely on the basis of how they affect recidivism rates. I've also been told that a lot of the individuals that are in those programs are unlikely to recidivate regardless of the existence of those programs. Just the mere fact that they're pursuing their education so diligently in an environment where it's very difficult to do that indicates that they're unlikely to reoffend. So they want to look at what value this provides beyond recidivism and to also be able to evaluate themselves, because there is really no way to measure the quality of a college and prison program currently. So they're doing this work with a big grant, and they're holding focus groups with alum of that program, and they're also holding focus groups inside the prison with current participants in that college and prison program. And I've been trying to get into those meetings. So like I said, I'm being welcomed in by this college and prison program, but I need permission from the Illinois Department of Corrections to get in. And so far, I've been continuously denied permission to go into that facility with really no explanation whatsoever. So I can guess, though, that they're not particularly happy about some of the reporting that I have done. Actually, the reason that I applied for this fellowship was because I did some reporting and I found out that they were spending really nothing on books for their prison libraries or educational programs as of late. So in the last few years compared to the early 2000s, that got a lot of attention in the state. And I think that they probably don't want to let me in potentially because I did a story that did not put them in necessarily the best light. This is the only explanation I've come up with because, as I said, they're not giving me any explanation whatsoever why they're not letting me into that program.
Well, how are you getting around those roadblocks?
So what I've been doing is I got connected through my prior reporting with a group called Books to Prisoners. They send books to inmates in facilities because they don't really have access to books otherwise unless they're having family members send them to them. And so this volunteer with that organization was very connected with several incarcerated people who were really eager to get an education. And so I have been writing letters with them, and now we're emailing, and now we're talking on the phone. And it's really exciting for me because this has actually happened quite recently. And it feels like a huge breakthrough in my reporting to be able to talk to people that are currently inside these facilities versus people that used to be and are now out on the outside.
Have you added any other new skills or techniques to your journalist toolbox since taking on this project?
I've definitely had to get a lot better at FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. One of the central pieces of this project is finding out how many people are participating in these programs, how many people are waitlisted, how many people are getting degrees. And I needed that data. So what I initially did was filed a FOIA asking for those numbers. And I was told that that wasn't really a FOIA because I was just asking for information. I wasn't asking for records. So a colleague of mine suggested that I FOIA for the records that the Office of Education and Vocational Services in the Illinois Department of Corrections keeps, and then that would give me an idea of what to FOIA for to find out those numbers that I was trying to get my hands on. And so I did that, and they said, we don't have such a list. So I was pretty frustrated. And then what I found out was that this particular office that oversees all the educational programming, they're required to put out reports. So what I ended up doing was filing for their reports. And that's how I got access to the numbers that I gave you at the top of the show. And it took a while. It took like a solid month because, as any journalist knows, all the institutions have at least 5 days to respond to you. Sometimes they extend that time. So it can be a really time-intensive process. But like I said, I've been really getting a lot better at how to phrase my FOIAs in order to get the information that I'm looking for.
Well, let me ask this. What advice do you have for a local reporter who may want to start looking at educational programs for the incarcerated in their own communities?
Well, I know that there are books to prisoners organizations all across the country, and I haven't talked to any outside of Illinois, but the folks that do this work inside Illinois tell me that they do it because the incarcerated people would not have access to reading material otherwise, because the department itself is spending very little money on books for its libraries and its programming. So if I were living in another state, I would start by looking at what are the volunteer organizations that exist around prisons? What are they doing and why are they doing it? Because talking to those organizations, that was how I learned that they potentially weren't spending very much money. So I ended up filing a Freedom of Information Act request to our state agency, our Illinois Department of Corrections, and was able to confirm what these volunteer groups had told me. So I would simply start talking to people that are advocates for the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated and start asking them, like, why do you do what you do? What are the problems that you're seeing? And then do your due diligence to confirm what they're telling you.
Lee Gaines reports on education from Illinois Public Media as part of the Illinois Newsroom Regional Journalism Collaborative. She's also an EWA Reporting Fellow. Lee, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.